Hello, everyone. I'm Paolo Zamora. I'm the program manager of CALD, and I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's book launch. Ms. Crisel Dayabes is an independent writer and journalist. She worked for major foreign newspapers and magazines such as Associated Press, Newsweek, Reuters, The Washington Post, and The Economist. She was born in Metro Manila, but spent her early years growing up in Zamboanga, in southern Philippines, where she developed an affection for the Muslim region, a favorite subject for her literary works. She's the author of critically acclaimed novels, including Crying Mountain, which was longlisted in the 2010 Man Asian Literary Prize, and Peace Warriors, which won the National Book Award for Nonfiction in 2012. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Miss Chris Yabes.
Good afternoon to everyone here in Manila, the Philippines, and to those watching us in Asia. Good morning in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. Welcome to the launch of Breathing Democracy, a playbook. We are live on the Facebook page of the Council of Asian Liberals and Democrats, or CALD. This guidebook's publication into the working and struggle of present-day democracy would not have been possible without the support of CALD's most valued partner, the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom. We thank both CALD and FNF for seeing this through. Sit back, relax, and join us for the next hour or so as we unveil to you the process of making this book. And later, I will let you know how you will be able to get an e-copy of Breathing Democracy for free. So without further ado, please allow me to introduce my esteemed colleague with whom I had the pleasure of co-writing this guidebook. She is the editor-at-large of Rappler News Online and is also a multi-awarded author. She will give us a look into what Breathing Democracy is all about. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Ms. Marites Vitug.
Thank you very much, Chris. Good afternoon to our viewers in Southeast Asia, and good morning to those joining us from Europe. Last year, when life was still normal, do you remember those days? Lito Arlegue, Executive Director of CALD, whom you see on the screen, Paulo Zamora, Program Manager, and I met over a Greek meal to talk about a book that CALD wanted published. CALD had a rich archive of speeches delivered in its annual meetings, and they wanted to organize this and put them together in a book. This book project got postponed for some reason, and Lito and Paulo reconnected with me early this year to pick up the thread of our 2019 conversation. It was then that we got Chris Yabes involved, whom you see on the screen. As you know, Chris is a journalist and novelist. We have worked on a couple of books together, and we know each other's rhythm and politics. This was in March, so we marked a date on our calendars to meet in a French coffee shop. And then the unthinkable happened. The virus struck, and one of the world's strictest and longest lockdowns began. Anyway, like everybody else, our meetings have since been virtual. I needed to mention this bit of background because looking back, our choices of restaurants by sheer coincidence had to do with the theme of our book, food and democracy. The link is not such a long shot, so it's not a stretch to connect the food we love to the system of government that we adhere to. As we know, Greece is the first known democracy in the world. And France, of course, is the country that gave us the inspiring watchwords liberty, equality, fraternity. So back to our discussions. Lito and Paulo had departed from their original idea of a compilation of speeches. They wanted a more reader-friendly book written in popular prose and something that democracy activists and politicians can find handy and useful, like a roadmap to where? To the main streets of liberal democracy. But along the way, the map would show the hurdles, the mean, pockmarked streets of authoritarianism, the deceptively smooth pathways to populism, and those narrow lanes that are difficult to navigate And of course, the forked roads. There was one pamphlet that inspired us, the Book of Radical Love. This was the campaign strategy of the opposition party in winning in Istanbul, Turkey's largest city, against all odds, in the face of a divided country, under the rule of an authoritarian leader. The pamphlet Radical Love had such an unlikely title that it caught a lot of people's attention. Its pages were filled with illustrated rules and advice as well as poems. For example, it listed 4 things to avoid in an election campaign: hubris, sarcasm, high politics, and haste. It had a how-to section on running an election campaign, dishing out do's and don'ts, from don't get provoked and be pulled into arguments to don't talk conceptually, be concrete. We tried to imbibe the spirit of radical love in this book, Breathing Democracy, a Playbook. We tried to be hopeful, more concrete than conceptual. Our content, however, is much broader, and our target readers are much more diverse, coming from various countries. All of you Asian liberals and Democrats out there. As you know, the issues can be complex. So we tried to navigate this minefield by answering 3 basic questions. First, what's the problem? Second, why should we care? Third, what can we do? The answers to these questions come from all those who spoke at CALD gatherings, all of you who contributed your thoughts and insights, those who lost and won elections, those who are hopeful about the decline of authoritarian rule, those who are fighting external powers that want to clamp down on democracies, that want to influence public opinion away from democracy, the young leaders who want to make a difference, those in exile who are painfully struggling to return to democracy, to a country they love, even if they are thousands of miles away. This book tells stories too of the victories and defeats of political parties, of women who are winning seats in government, but not enough, of the highs and lows of democracies in a number of countries, and the challenging information landscape and how to fight fake news, a weapon of mass destruction. To close, I would like to quote from the book. There are many ways we can dispel the dark clouds of populism and fight the heavy hand of authoritarianism. We can act as citizens, armed with our civic duties, and as members of organizations and political parties. But first, we have to come together, unite with like-minded forces so that we are stronger. We can protest together, we can speak with one voice, and hold the powerful to account. We can win elections. We can be better public servants guided by the common good, attuned to the people's needs. We cannot afford to be disparate, otherwise we will be scattered to the winds, and the side that is against democracy will prey on us and our countries. With those words, I close my introduction. Thank you for listening and good day. May I now introduce our guest of honor, the former Prime Minister of Thailand and former leader of the Democrat Party, a thinker, and in today's social media world, an influencer. Let's welcome Kun Abesit Wejajiwa. He will give us his thoughtful remarks as always. You have to unmute. Oops.
Swadee krab. I'm in Bangkok and I'm very pleased to be able to join all of you at the launch of the Breathing Democracy Playbook. Let me first start by congratulating the authors, Mauritius and Chris, for what I feel is a very well written and well presented book on a very, very important topic. I was particularly impressed by the concise nature of the book and yet the breadth of coverage of topics that are in this book. I'm especially pleased because certainly during my time as chair of CALD and during my work with many colleagues in CALD, we find ourselves often trapped in the day-to-day problems and the immediate situation before us. And despite the fact that we have been around for well over 20 years, sometimes we didn't notice that there had been a global recession of liberal democracy. And indeed, when we take stock of things, maybe over the last few years, and look back, we would probably be a little shocked by the differences in atmosphere compared to when CALD was established just after the Berlin Wall came down at the end of the Cold War. Then, I think with the democracy maturing and making progress in many Southeast Asian countries, from the Philippines to Thailand to Indonesia, and we were so excited that liberal democracy at last was going to be established in the region. And yet, in recent years, many of us find ourselves maybe back in situation even before the days that CALD was formed in terms of democratic progress. This book, of course, will also cover many of the country experience that will highlight the ups and downs of democracy. But what I think is significant is by putting things together in a conceptual framework, if you like, where the questions that are being asked about what the problem is, why should we care and what we should do, we've got a book that finally really captures the challenge facing all of us liberal Democrats in the region. In particular, I think the book covers the threats to liberal democracy, not just from the old sources of threats to liberal democracy, military dictatorship, and so on, and autocrats, but also the rise of elected populists who pose new threats and therefore give us new challenges as far as trying to stay true to our liberal democratic ideals. And what I think the book shows is that we can no longer take liberal democracy for granted. I think for too long, liberals and Democrats around the world were too complacent, somehow thinking that the progress that we have made in terms of democratization would be irreversible, and that somehow we have built a system that is strong enough to look after itself. What we discover even today is that not just in emerging economies or developing countries, but even in what we see as established democracies, they are also facing the same challenges and threats. Indeed, I recall that in 2017, I was invited to the US, funnily enough, to give a talk about what they might have to expect from a newly elected President Trump and how that would pose a challenge or a threat to their own system of government. I recall that not just me, but also there were politicians from other countries that had faced elected populists who had undermined liberal democracy in their respective countries, that at the time we could analyze the causes of the slide or recession in liberal democracy in our respective countries. We can describe the problems that we face, and all we could do was talk about all the things that we have tried to defeat this threat, and most of us say without success. But in this book, it is good to see that we have recorded instances where such problems can be overcome. So this book is indeed very, very important. For me, the significant contributions and coverage of this book go as follows. First of all, I was pleased to see that the book reminds us very strongly the importance of our ideals. In a section about why we should care, what would happen if we allowed these threats to liberal democracy to dominate our systems of government, and what we could expect in terms of the damages done to our economies, to our country, and indeed to our people. Also, because we have the experience of a wide variety of countries in the region, there is a great deal of diversity and also a richness of experience that we can share and use. I have to remind many of our colleagues and politicians that we often see many of our work, political work, and focusing on just the local aspect and believing that the circumstances and problems that we face are somehow unique to our country and to our society. I think what this book does clearly is to show that that is not really the case. And there are so many similarities and shared experience that would be valuable for us to gain a perspective of why some of these problems are regional or are even global. I'm also pleased to see that there are specific sections on youth, on the role of women, and also on the media, particularly focusing on social media and the new technology. Because I think we are also seeing around the region and also around the world that youth is now reasserting its role in taking on some of the problems that their countries face, and is now providing the kind of energy and push for change towards a better system of government. I think also in the area of the role of women is where, despite the recession of liberal democracy that we talk about, I think there has been substantial gains. Gender politics is an area where I think liberals and Democrats have been able to hold up quite well in the various countries that we operate. And of course, finally, the media itself is throwing up new challenges. Yes, we have a very important and powerful tool now to advance our cause, but at the same time, there are aspects of the technology, issues concerning polarization, the efficiency and effectiveness by which disinformation, fake news can spread, that could very much undermine the system. And again, we also have recorded in the book some of the tools that are also available to deal with this problem. So all in all, again, I would like to congratulate the authors. I believe that this book will be very valuable, but I also have to remind all of us that the fight to establish a sustained liberal and democratic system is still a long road ahead. And with all the praise I have for the book, we cannot pretend that this playbook is something that will offer a solution for everybody or even be any kind of guarantee of success. And indeed, even if we have the right ideas, there are also challenges concerning the implementation of what we want to do. And of course, the situation continues to be dynamic. It will continue to evolve. And no doubt, liberal democracies will also face newer challenges from the various trends that we are seeing in the world. But once again, thank you to the authors for great work that they've done. And I'm sure that this book would be valuable for liberals and Democrats in the region to continue their fight. Thank you.
Thank you, Kunabisit, for your kind words. Your thoughts and ideas have greatly contributed to the scope of this book, which made it easy for us to digest and write. For the audience out there, please let me give you a glimpse of Breathing Democracy. A reminder to everyone, the ebook of Breathing Democracy will be sent to registered participants, as well as those who are in the CALD assembly. Unregistered viewers may receive their copies by simply liking the Facebook page of CALD and leaving their email address in Messenger. So now on to the next stage of our launch. I give you my colleague Marites Vitug once again for her fireside chat with Kunabisit. Marites, fire away.
Okay, sorry, I had to unmute myself. Kunabisit, this is our fireside chat, so we hope that we leave our readers with our viewers with burning thoughts today. So I'll be asking you questions about the book first, and then on issues that relate to liberal democracy. So we're very happy that you found the book useful. But what is missing from the book? Is there anything that you would have wanted to read or to find in the book?
Well, the issue of liberal democracy and the current global recession of democracy, you could, cover many aspects. And I think it would be unfair to say that, this book misses this or misses that. But I think there are 2 or 3 things that I think are also important as far as the issue is concerned, that we might have to probe a little further. The first is, I think the issue of trust in democracy and in democratic politicians is an issue that we need to explore a little more. In the end, I think democracy will survive or not. Much will depend on the people's trust and faith in the system. And there can be no doubt that the current recession of liberal democracy around the world has been due to the fact that there has been dissatisfaction or distrust of politicians that arise from such a system. And so maybe, if we could probe a little more into this issue of how you can build trust, how you can sustain trust, it would offer perhaps at a deeper level of how we can sustain or help promote democracy. The second issue that I think perhaps we could emphasize a little more on is the role of corruption. I think that is an issue, again, related to what I mentioned earlier about trust, that often becomes the downfall of democracy. And in particular, I think in societies where people tend not to focus on systems and institutions, and so they take people or personalities as representation of that system and of institutions. Often they can become easily disappointed by the persons, and then blame that not on the persons, but also on the system and on the institutions. So I think that's probably the only the aspect that I think we could use a little more of, so that we can be aware of the need to preserve trust and to deal with the issue of corruption and abuse of power.
And yes, as you said, the issues are complex. So to be able to discuss trust and the role of corruption and the role of the system and institutions, do you think that could be a sequel for the book, or would you have another sequel in mind if CALD were to do a follow-up?
I can see you're confident of the success now. You're talking about a sequel, right? Well, that is one road we could go down, but I was thinking a little differently, in a sense that when you say breathing democracy, I don't know what people's first impression would be, but when I see the word like breathing, we think about survival, right? But I'd hope. I mentioned in my earlier remarks that even this book cannot pretend to have all the solutions and to claim to have any kind of guarantee of success for people who practice the ideas in this book. But I think another road that's worth exploring is that often democracies do not want to talk about their own success. I think we're very good at being critical even of ourselves, that sometimes we have to remind people that there have been concrete achievements through democracy, through liberalism, so that they see the value of liberal democracy even more. So, if this book is truly a success, by which I mean not just people read it and practice the ideas in it, but also succeed, maybe the sequel could be, something like Living or Thriving Democracies, where we can actually celebrate the successes of liberal democracy.
Oh, that's a very optimistic thought. So I think CALD will take note of that. And going to issues surrounding the current events today, why is it important to make a distinction? We just don't talk about democracy, but you always stress liberal democracy. There is an illiberal democracy, and there are illiberal democracies. So can you talk about this distinction that we have to make?
Sure. First of all, I think forms of illiberal democracy might be classified as some form of majoritarianism, where there is claim to legitimacy from having support of the majority, however that support is obtained, and without paying any attention to how that power that is won is used. So that use of power would become abuse in the forms of discrimination against minorities, silencing critics, and so on. And therefore, you would not, certainly for us, liberals and Democrats, we would not call that situation or that system a true democracy. And I think this distinction has become much, much more important because, when we talk about the new threats to democracy, if we look at it from the point of view of the autocrats, the authoritarians, I think they have been able to smartly morph themselves to give the appearance of being democratic or having some kind of democratic legitimacy. And so we need to make this distinction, keep this distinction, to stop the autocrats and authoritarians who may come from elections, who may imitate so much of the democratic system, and yet are not democratic in spirit and continue to undermine the very values of democracy and the foundations, by which we, of course, means that there is equality of people who have the right to determine their future.
Yeah, speaking of forms of illiberal democracy, the United States, I think, is a recent example, and it's timely to talk about it now that there's a new president-elect. But we've seen how President Trump has tried to undermine the election, but finally, he has given the go signal, apparently, for a transition. What is the impact of this on the rest of the world and on us, on our democracies also in this part of the world?
Well, I think the last 4 years of President Trump has been very difficult for liberals and Democrats around the world, because the US, which has often been seen as a leader of the free world, had a leader that clearly, explicitly seemed to deny or undermine some of the key values of liberal democracy, including the support for multilateralism. So I think the last 4 years, liberals and Democrats around the world had been resigned to the fact that the kind of leadership that we could expect from the US is no longer there. Now we have a different challenge, certainly for the president-elect. He now needs to show that liberal democracy can succeed So it's very much back to the previous question as to whether we could make that happen. Because if the next 4 years cannot clearly spell out the differences between having a liberal democratic and a non-liberal democratic leader in a country like the US, then I'm sure liberal democracy will be questioned around the world. So I think that's really it, and we hope that the next 4 years will show that liberal democracy can be restored and can take things forward.
So that's the major challenge President-elect Biden is facing, is to show that democracy can work and work with like-minded countries as well. How do you see this playing out here in Southeast Asia when not all countries are liberal democracies?
Well, the two, I guess, conflicting trends. I think the first is that if we are correct in our appraisal of the difference between the two men, we can expect more consistency. We can expect a return to a respect for international law, multilateralism, and the kind of support for liberal and democratic values in general. On the other hand, because so many countries in the region are facing challenges to their own systems, the thing with President Trump is that he didn't pay much attention to the domestic political problems in terms of democracy or human rights, as you would expect of a US leader. On the other hand, if the president-elect and President Biden does focus on this issue, he also needs to recognize that handling this issue as a foreign power needs to understand some sensitivity, because sometimes the lack of sensitivity can be counterproductive. I noticed that the tension, if you like, in many countries in the region around this issue of liberal democracy now has a sort of international dimension to it. Actually, it always has, because, you recall the issue about Asian values and whether liberal democracy is a Western concept or invention. So President Biden needs to be careful if as I think he will, wants to support liberal democracy in the region. He needs to show sensitivity and handle it in a careful way.
Yes, speaking of a divided America, polarization is not only in the US, but also in Thailand and in other countries, which we've seen in the past few years. So what can leaders do to address this big problem of polarization?
Well, I can tell you Thailand is way ahead of the curve on this one.
You have lessons to share with the rest of the world.
I wish we had the answer, because as you know, here in Thailand, we now have a new dimension of polarization, if you like, in terms of conflicts between generations now, because of the youth are now very much propelling the protests and the calls for change, and are being resisted by the conservative elites, in particular in the country. I would say this. I think we talked before that part of this is due to the new technology, how we now receive information, all of us, and how the social media and the internet too easily creates echo chambers and do not really allow people to engage with people who think differently in a constructive or creative way. So my initial thought is we somehow need to bring back space where people could share different views in a civil way and begin to, if you like, prepare people to act differently when it comes to receiving, sharing, and exchanging information. That they have to try to be more deliberate in going out of their way to listen to different points of view, and be tolerant. And even if they retain those disagreements, um, express themselves in ways that are not conducive to more conflict and hatred.
It's really a tough challenge. And my final question for you, Kun Abisit, is since we're still in the time of the pandemic, although Thailand has been doing very well, you had zero transmission for some weeks now. So maybe that's why the demonstrations increased. But anyway, my last question is what is a big lesson or one big lesson that liberal democratic leaders can learn from this pandemic? Has it really changed the world entirely, or are we just going to see this as something that will keep the status quo after the pandemic leaves?
Well, at the general level, I think what the pandemic has done is probably speeded up the process that we call disruption in general. So the way we do things are different now. We are at this very moment engaged in a new form of fireside chat or conference. And so I think the pandemic has contributed to the speeding up of some of the disruptions caused by technology. It will obviously throw up questions about our economic structures, especially for economies that are very open, that are very reliant on global supply chains, on tourism, exchanges of people, and so on. Whether we can continue to rely on these as engines of growth if something like the pandemic is going to happen again, and what precautions we could take or what kind of insurance we could take out. But for liberal democracy, that's a tough one because it would be, I think, mistaken to draw lessons about the successes and failures and try to relate them to particular political systems. I think the temptation for many people is to say, oh, look, the countries that are good at keeping order, particularly through authoritarian powers, have done better. And look at what's happening in Europe or in the US and how democracy is not equipped to deal with this. I think that would be mistaken because I think people have also pointed out that there are equally, there are examples on either side, democracies that have dealt well with the pandemic. You look at the experience of New Zealand, Taiwan, and so on, and also failures arising from the autocrats around the world also. But I think it is, if there is a lesson that we should also try to extract, is there are some values of liberal democracy that I think can support the good management of situations like this. So, for instance, I don't think you can succeed in dealing with the pandemic without transparency, without winning the support and cooperation of the public, of the people at large, which I think are very much what we as liberals and Democrats should support. The other thing, of course, is it reminds us that you cannot be extreme or say some things are absolute. The politicized, issues like masks being politicized in countries like the US. I think that's just taking the concept of freedom or liberty to an extreme. You need to have to balance some of that because this is something that affects the public at large and other people's rights. So it's not easy to summarize or try to say this is the one big lesson, but I think there are plenty of thoughts and lessons there for liberals and Democrats following the pandemic.
Thank you very much, Kunabisit. On that note, we end our fireside chat, and we hope our viewers are left with some burning thoughts from this discussion. Back to you, Chris.
Okay, thank you, Marites. Thank you, Kunabisit. That was really, really a fascinating chat, even if it was just for a few minutes. You've covered so many things, and it, in a way, gives us a look ahead into what might happen in the future. We don't know when the pandemic will end, and what might happen in America after President Biden's election. Well, we're now open to questions from the audience, and may I remind the questioners and the speakers to please be brief with their questions and answers so that we can accommodate others. Is there like a first question from the audience? Anyone?
Yeah, it's on the screen, Chris.
Okay, there's one question from Audrey Frias, Audrey Simeona Frias. And the question is, I think for Kunabisit mentioned that Democrats are not very comfortable about talking of our own success. Actually, that was one thing that struck me too, and I took note of it. And I was thinking if nobody had asked that question, I would have asked you. Do you have specific suggestions on how we can better promote democratic success stories in a way that appeals to the people?
The question says that Democrats are not very comfortable about talking. I think are not very good at rather than comfortable.
Or you do not. You said you.
The reason is this.
Does not offer the success.
The reason is this. I think too often as politicians, when we succeed, we try to pin that success on us as people, as parties, as leaders. And often we don't recognize that that success would not have been possible had there not been liberal democracy supporting it in the system. So, for instance, here in Thailand, even today, there's so much talk about, what have politicians done for the people? But, many of the significant policies that affect people's lives, whether it's free education, universal health coverage, even income support for the elderly, all these would not have happened had there not been a liberal democratic system in place. Because it's the system that really forced many of the politicians to get to grips with these issues. That's not to say that, at the time when we don't enjoy liberal democracy, there are no achievements. But you can mostly tell the differences between policies that come from a democratic process and policies that come from a more bureaucratic or technocratic process. And I think so many policy successes related to people's lives, of things that people can relate to, need to thank liberal democracy and not just the leader or the party or the government of the day that push for those policies.
Thank you, Kunabisit. Is there another question from the audience? Okay, there's one more from Rosel Lazaro. And the question is, the CALD youth had a discussion yesterday and someone asked, are liberals in a bubble? Can you answer that, Kunabisit?
They can be. They can be, and they have to be careful not to be. And one of the things that I certainly have tried to convey in many speeches to liberals is how those who do not share our ideals often see us. And the common criticisms against liberals need to be taken seriously. Are we too obsessed with the process that somehow we fail to deliver? Are we too slow? Is the process too messy? Can we not somehow take a shortcut to achieving something? And the most serious of all, I think, is that, and this is a point that is also in the book, I believe that much of the undermining of liberal democracy over the last couple of decades has been the failure of liberals and Democrats to grasp this issue, that people see us as excessively favoring the market, so that so many people are left out and lose out from economic development. And that disappointment, frustration, or resentment has come back to give life to populists and authoritarians and autocrats around the world.
Yes.
So we need to be aware of our critics, and mustn't just talk in a bubble about we have this belief and we have to push for it, and not be aware of how others see us.
Yes. Thank you, Kunabisit. And the next one is from Thomas JT. And his question is there a need to define and localize liberalism according to our custom for wider understanding and appreciation? I suppose that mean it means the Asian custom, I guess, I would think.
I recall in some of the meetings that we had in the CALD, where our Indonesian colleagues explicitly mentioned that the term liberalism somehow would not be helpful for them in pushing for their ideals in their country. And you know how even in the US, the term liberal has been used almost as an abuse from many here towards right or center right. So I can understand why when we talk about liberal and democratic values, how we need to tailor that to local customs or culture. But there is a warning here. We mustn't give in to the temptation that some of the ideals and values that we share, which are universal or global in nature, can be compromised by this idea that, it's not going to be applicable here. Because that would play straight into the hands of many of our opponents of authoritarian nature, sometimes playing into nationalistic populist sentiment. So I think it's important to retain the values and ideals, but you will have to find ways of expressing the findings that would be most effective in the environment.
Was that last part clear enough? Yes. Okay. No, I think there must be just something wrong with the audio. You were coming in and out, but I suppose that was clear enough, I think, towards the end, no? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so let's move on. This question is from Margaret Ray Dadpaas. And the question is, should liberals rethink our priorities and strategies in responding to current democratic challenges?
Well, I can obviously not offer a general solution on this, but clearly each country will face its own priorities in the political world, and liberals and Democrats need to align their priorities with those of the people's. But what I would say, going back to what I said earlier about the problem that we have had over the last couple of decades, where I think the problem of inequality has been blamed on the liberals and those who support the market. That and I experienced this firsthand when I attended the Liberal International meeting a few years back, trying to write a new liberal manifesto. That too many of our colleagues are still too reluctant to allow for government intervention in the economic system to support the disadvantaged, because they are still afraid of upsetting the market system, if you like. I think we need to be clear that the market system cannot deliver in terms of distribution problems, and that if you want a well-functioning market and a well-functioning democracy, you have to empower people, and people cannot be empowered if they do not have their basic needs satisfied. And the challenge for many countries now is, especially in times of volatility and uncertainty, is that governments need to offer people security, which means a much more comprehensive welfare system. And therefore, some of these policies may not be palatable to the extreme liberals, if you like. And I think that's where they need to reassess their priorities and ideas.
Okay, thank you. Do we have another one? Oh, yes. Okay, one again from Rosel Lazaro. I think she had a question previously. So her question is, if you are to make a list, what should be the top priorities slash issues that liberals in Asia should address in the next 5 years or so?
Wow.
Yeah, I know, it's huge.
It will probably be a book, not a list, right?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, again, getting back to the book itself, we need to be aware of the challenges from populists and from autocrats and authoritarians. And so we need to remind ourselves and the people the value of liberal democracy in defending the basic rights of people, so that people will be allowed, will have the power to determine their future, which is at the heart of our fight for liberal democracy. Secondly, as I said, this issue of economic security and the need to prove that liberal democracy can deliver in concrete terms, whether it's on the economic area or in education or health, that we have solutions for people. And I mentioned gender politics already, which I think is something that can continue to make advances. And now also we need to align our priorities also with the priorities of youth and young people, because they may have different priorities than we do. And I think much of what they're fighting for is very much consistent with liberal and democratic values.
Okay, thank you. Is there another question there before we move on? Okay, there's a next question here, but I can't read the name because it's in the Thai script, I think. So the question is, do you think this book will be helpful to your people in the Philippines or Thailand, and in what way?
Well, it will be useful for those of us fighting for liberal democracy, and of course people in the crowd. We're all doing that. Whether it will be helpful to the people depends on the success as we try to implement some of the ideas that have been put forward in the book. And as I say, there is no guarantee of that. It's not going to be an easy task, but certainly it will be helpful for people, for those of us who try to continue to fight.
Marites, what do you think?
Actually, I will be happy. I think Chris and I will be happy if we see people carrying the book and talking about it. Of course, there will be a hard copy next year, but now it's just it's still online. But we would be happy to see people reading it. And it's not, as you said, Kun Abisit, it's not a guide to success. You know, it's not like 1, 2, that doesn't 12 steps to achieve liberal democracy. I wish we could do something like that, but it has its uses, and as I think Chris was saying in an earlier meeting, that if more of this could be done on other issues that relate to liberal democracy, maybe in forms of comics or animation, and I think we'll do a good job in spreading the word.
Okay. Yes, good luck to all of us. But no, I just wanted to ask one last thing, because when we were working on the book, you made reference to Gabriel Garcia Marquez's novel, Love in the Time of the Cholera. Is that your favorite? Or did you just happen to read it and somehow
No,
link?
I refer to that in my TED talk. I think at the airline meeting.
Okay.
But there are so many books that
But is
that I
it your
think
favorite?
inspires. No, not
Not
my
really.
favorite.
Okay. Okay. So I think let's wind up today's launch. Does anyone want to give any final remark or anything?
Jayanti, I think, is in.
Jayanti back? Are we? Yes.
Yes, she's here on standby.
Oh, okay, great. So we're about to end the launch, and to formally close the program, please allow me to introduce the chairperson of CALD Women's Caucus, who also serves as president of the International Network of Liberal Women. She's a lawyer who hails from Malaysia, and she has been working tirelessly for the protection and empowerment of women. Let us please welcome Jayanti Devi Balaguru. Audio.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, perfect.
Thank you very much, Chris, for your kind introduction. In
Yes.
forward of Breathing Democracy, Playbook, CALD chairperson Kiko Pangilinan quoted Chilean writer Isabel Allen, who said, and I quote, "The most important reason for writing is to prevent the erosion of time, so that memories will not be blown away by the wind. Write to register history and name each thing. Write what should not be forgotten." End quote. This quote demonstrates the power of words, especially when put into writing. We can even argue that the entire history of the human race has been a struggle to control who gets to propagate their written words, on who gets to control the narrative, because whoever controls the narrative has the power. In the process of writing history, we know that a lot of voices were silenced, that of colonized people, of minority groups, of women. Today, we are again being silenced. In Hong Kong, the expulsion or forced resignation of pro-democracy legislators means that mainland China would have absolute control on how things are run in the once free cosmopolitan city. In Cambodia, the dissolution of the main opposition party and the continuing persecution of its leaders, as reflected in the recent summons issued by the court, shows that Hun Sen is really bent on destroying all traces of the political opposition. In the Philippines, the continuing incarceration of Senator Leila de Lima, one of Duterte's most vocal critics, reflects the descent of Philippines into authoritarianism.
So thank you so much, Shayanti, for your message, your inspiring message, and may you carry on with the good work, the liberal democracy's good work. It's time to say goodbye, and thank you once again to all our speakers this afternoon, and to all those watching us on Facebook. Don't forget the link to your ebook copy by liking and messaging CALD on Facebook. Have a good day.